Hello, friends. Welcome back to library. Thank you for joining me. So, we left off in the story Flora and Ulysses with the mother getting a vacuum cleaner for her birthday. And Flora is upstairs reading her comic books, the Incandesto, and watching out the window at this noise. And Flora is up there saying, "Wait, you're going to run over the squirrel." And mom is there not able to control that magnificent vacuum cleaner, and we hear poof foomp, and Flora says, "Holy bagumba." So I think she stood at the window and she watched as the squirrel was vacuumed up. So chapter 2, the mind of a squirrel. Not much goes on in the mind of a squirrel, although I'm going to think that if I was vacuumed up even as a squirrel, I'm going to have some thoughts about that. But never mind. Not much goes on in the mind of a squirrel. Huge portions of what is loosely termed the squirrel brain are given over to one thought: food. The average squirrel cogitation goes something like this: I wonder what there is to eat. This thought is then repeated with small variations. Example: where's the food? Man, I sure am hungry. Is that a piece of food? And are there more pieces of food? Some 6 or 7 thousand times a day. All of this is to say that when the squirrel is in the Tickums backyard got swallowed up by the Ulysses 2000X, there weren't a lot of terribly profound thoughts going through his head. As the vacuum cleaner roared toward him, he did not, for instance, think, "Here at last is my fate come to meet me." He did not think, "Oh, please give me one more chance and I will be good." What he thought was, "Man, I sure am hungry." And then there was a terrible roar, and he was sucked right off his feet. At that point, there were no thoughts in his squirrel head, not even thoughts of food. Chapter 3: The Death of a Squirrel. Oh no. Seemingly, swallowing a squirrel was a bit much for the powerful, indomitable, indoor-outdoor Ulysses 2000X. Mrs. Tickham's birthday machine let out an uncertain roar and stuttered to a stop. Mrs. Tickham bent over and looked down at the vacuum cleaner. There was a tail sticking out of it. "For heaven's sake," said Mrs. Tickham, "what's next?" She dropped to her knees and gave the tail a tentative tug. She stood. She looked around the yard. "Help," she said. "I think I've killed a squirrel." Chapter 4: A surprisingly helpful cynic. Flora ran from her room. She ran down the stairs. As she ran, she thought, "For a cynic, I am a surprisingly helpful person." She went out the back door. Her mother called to her. She said, "Where are you going, Flora Belle?" Flora didn't answer her. She never answered her mother when she called her Flora Belle. Sometimes she didn't answer her mother when she called her Flora either. Flora ran through the tall grass and cleared the fence between her yard and the Tickums in a single bound. "Move out of the way," said Flora. She gave me Mrs. Tickum. She gave Miss Tickum a shove and grabbed hold of the vacuum cleaner. It was heavy. She picked it up and shook it. Nothing happened. She shook harder. The squirrel dropped out of the vacuum cleaner and landed with a plop on the grass. He didn't look that great. He was missing a lot of fur, vacuumed off, Flora assumed. His eyelids fluttered. His chest rose and fell again, and then it stopped moving altogether. Flora knelt. She put a finger on the squirrel's chest. At the back of each issue of the illuminated adventures of the amazing Incandesto, there was a series of bonus comics. One of Flora's very favorite bonus comic was entitled, "Terrible Things Can Happen to You." As a cynic, Flora found it wise to be prepared. Who knew what horrible, unpredicted thing would happen next? Terrible things can happen to you. Detailed what action to take if you inadvertently consumed plastic fruit. This happens more often than you would suppose. Some plastic fruit was extremely realistic looking. how to perform the Heimlich maneuver on your elderly Aunt Edith if she choked on a stringy piece of steak at an all-you-can-eat buffet, what to do if you were wearing a striped shirt and a swarm of locusts descended. Run, locusts eat stripes. And of course, how to administer everyone's favorite life-saving technique, CPR. Terrible things can happen to you did not, however, detail exactly how someone was supposed to give CPR to a squirrel. I'll figure it out, said Flora. What will you figure out? Said Miss Tickum. Flora didn't answer her. Instead, she bent down and put her mouth on the squirrel's mouth. It tasted funny. If she were forced to describe it, she would say that it tasted exactly like squirrel, fuzzy, damp, slightly nutty. Have you lost your mind? Said Mrs. Tickum. Flora ignored her. She breathed into the squirrel's mouth. She pushed down on his small chest and started to count. Chapter 5. The Squirrel Obliges. Something strange had happened to the squirrel's brain. Things had gone black, and then into this black blankness there was a light so beautiful, so bright that the squirrel had to turn away. A voice spoke to him. What's that? Said the squirrel. The light shone brighter. The voice spoke again. Okay, said the squirrel. You bet. He wasn't sure what exactly he was agreeing to, but it didn't matter. He was just so happy. He was floating in a great lake of light, and the voice was singing to him. Oh, it was wonderful. It was the best thing ever. And then there was a loud noise. The squirrel heard another voice. This voice was counting. The light receded. Breathe! The new voice shouted. The squirrel obliged. He took a breath. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another, and another. The squirrel returned. Chapter 6. In the event of a seizure. Well, he's breathing, said Miss Tickum. Yes, said Flora, he is. She felt a swell of pride. The squirrel rolled over onto his stomach. He raised his head. His eyes were glazed. For heaven's sake, said Miss Tickum, look at him. She chuckled quietly. She shook her head, and then she laughed out loud. She kept laughing. She laughed and laughed and laughed. She laughed so hard that she started to shake. Was she having some kind of fit? Flora tried to remember what terrible things can happen to you, advised in the event of a seizure. It had something to do with moving the tongue out of the way or stabilizing it with a stick or something. Flora had saved the squirrel's life. She didn't see any reason she couldn't save Miss Tickham's tongue. The sun sank a little lower in the sky. Mrs. Tickum continued to laugh hysterically, and Flora Belle Buckman started looking around the Tickham's backyard for a stick. So, Flora was up in her room reading her comic books, The Great Incandesto. She looks out her window and she sees the vacuum of Mrs. Tickum sucking up a squirrel. She runs down and goes and saves that squirrel. So I'm wondering if that squirrel is going to befriend our friend Flora. I'm wondering if Mrs. Tickum is Flora's mom or if it's a neighbor. I think it might be a neighbor. I have a lot of questions about this book so far. I hope you are enjoying Flora and Ulysses. Just given the title, I have a feeling that the squirrel is going to be Ulysses. I don't know. I could be wrong. But I hope you're enjoying it, and stay tuned for our next segment of Flora and Ulysses. Bye, everyone. Have a great week.